Welcome to Friend or Foe, the series where I analyze characters from our favorite games and figure out if they would be good to hang out with or whether you might want to avoid them at the next party. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and in this episode, we're getting to know Telltale Games' most famous Floridian, Kenny. As always, I've created a playlist for this series, so you can easily keep up with it and watch every episode available anytime. I'll link that in the description down below. Hailing from the Sunshine State, Kenny was a commercial fisherman prior to the start of the zombie outbreak. He lived with his wife, Katjaa, and son, Ken Jr., better known as Duck, in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. In addition to being a decent fisherman, Kenny was well versed in the inner workings of the combustion engine, having learned a great deal from his dad while growing up, and he's able to figure out how to fix just about any mechanical issue that pops up. Just before society fell, Kenny and his family took a trip to Memphis, Tennessee, to visit Katjaa's sister and probably partake in some pretty delicious barbecue. They were on their way back to Florida when they found out the hard way that people were eating each other, as Duck was attacked by what Kenny thought was a man at a gas station. Going as far south as they could, they eventually wound up seeking refuge at the farm of Herschel Green, near a small town in Georgia. It was there that Kenny met a man named Lee, who would wind up being one of his closest friends and allies over the next several months. The morning after Lee arrived, Kenny was working on his pickup truck, as it had been having some issues, when the sound of a tractor and screaming erupted from behind the farmhouse. Rushing over, he found Lee trying to help Duck, who was struggling to escape from a zombie. Making his way to the boy, he was able to free him and get him safely away from danger. But Herschel's son wasn't so lucky. Zombies broke through the fence the young man had been repairing, eating him alive right before Herschel arrived with a gun to stop them. Right away, Kenny knew it was his fault. His son had been the one on the tractor, accidentally starting it and trapping Herschel's son. If he'd kept Duck closer, or maybe done something more, Herschel's boy wouldn't have been killed. But there wasn't time to dwell on that, as Herschel demanded everyone leave the farm. Wanting to repay Lee for helping Duck, Kenny offered him and the little girl that was with him a ride to Macon. It was more or less on the way to where they were going anyway, and it was the least that he could do. They had just enough gas in the truck to get to Macon, and the truck rolled to a stop on an empty street near a pharmacy that they would wind up taking shelter in after mistaking some zombies in the street for people. A woman named Carly and a man named Glenn would come to the rescue as Kenny and his group were attacked, but Duck and Katjaa were nearly killed as they escaped the horde. Getting into the pharmacy, an old man was yelling at the people who'd saved them, and the situation took a bad turn when he accused Duck of being bitten. Lee stood with Kenny as they defended Duck, making him glad that he chose to bring the man along. Lee's little girl, Clementine, was attacked by a zombie that had been hiding in the bathroom, and the old man, Larry, had some kind of heart issue before things finally quieted down. While Kenny tended to his family, Lee and Glenn took charge of getting the pharmacy open and figuring out what the next steps would be. They needed supplies, especially medicine for Larry, and they needed to decide whether to try to fortify the pharmacy or find another base of operations. Both problems will be remedied over the next few hours, as Lee and Carly went to rescue Glenn from a nearby motel, and Lee secured the keys to the pharmacy. Unfortunately, an alarm went off as Lee and Larry's daughter Lily opened the pharmacy door, and they only had a few brief moments to escape the building as the noise brought every zombie in the area looking for a meal. Making his way through the streets, Kenny managed to reach his pickup and add the gas that Glenn had scavenged before pulling it up the alley so everyone could hop in. As he counted the survivors, however, he realized that Lee wasn't there. Rushing back inside, he found his new friend sprawled on the floor and helped him up just in time. They were able to escape the downtown area, stopping at the motor inn Glenn had found earlier with plans to make it into a temporary base. The hope was that the army or some other branch of the military would roll through sooner rather than later and provide some relief. But there was no one coming to save them. The next 3 months were rough as they worked to secure their new home and scavenge supplies. They found a new guy, Mark, who had holed up in the nearby military base with what seemed like an enormous supply of food, and he was more than happy to join them. The food wasn't as plentiful as it looked, however, and it ran out a lot sooner than they expected. It wasn't long after when Kenny found himself hunting in the woods near the motor inn on a warm fall day. He, Mark, and Lee had gone out looking for whatever they could find, separating to cover more ground. Before he could find anything, though, the sound of shouting in the distance grabbed his attention. Thinking Lee or Mark could be hurt, he took off running, eventually coming across a pair of kids standing next to a man who was caught in a bear trap. Lee and Mark had arrived just before he did, and they were all quickly joined by a herd of zombies as the man kept screaming in pain. Lee tried his best, but the only way to free the man was to cut off his leg. As they were fleeing the area, one of the kids tripped over something and wound up being eaten before anyone could help him. They returned to the camp a few minutes later with the injured man and the other kid, Ben. Things were bad enough, but Lily made it all worse by picking a fight with them for saving people. She'd been really difficult to get along with, and she kept challenging Kenny for leadership, as if she would be any better at it than he would. Things finally calmed down, but not before Lily forced Lee to hand out the food rations for the day. That wasn't a bad decision, however, as Kenny watched Lee ensure the kids had something to eat before handing out anything else. As hungry and angry as he was with Lily, knowing that there was someone else in the group that would do the right thing for the young ones made him feel a little better. The man they brought back didn't make it, despite Katjaa's best efforts, but they didn't even have time to dwell on that before the man reanimated and started attacking Katjaa. Lee saved her with a little help from Carly, and Kenny turned his attention to Ben, who told them the man wasn't bitten. He'd barely started yelling at the teen when Ben dropped the news that they were all infected. The bite wasn't what caused someone to turn. Dying was enough to make that happen, and they would all likely wind up turning when they died. It was a bombshell that they barely had a moment to process before being interrupted by a pair of men coming out of the woods. They were looking for gas for the electric fence that protected their dairy farm, and they offered to provide the group with food if they could spare some. Lee, Mark, Carly, and Ben went with the pair of men, the St. John brothers, to check the place out, with Carly and Ben returning a couple hours later to report the farm was real and looked like it could be good. Making their way to the farm, watching out for bandits as Carly told them there had been a couple on the trip that she took, everyone was looking forward to a good meal. Ben and Carly had eaten all of the biscuits that the St. John's brothers' mom had provided, but they knew that there would be plenty more at the farm. As the group approached the area Carly had told them about, the first thing they noticed was Lee and Mark standing near the St. John brothers. And Mark had an arrow in his shoulder. He'd apparently been shot by a bandit while he and Lee were inspecting the fence, but Brenda, the matron of the St. John family, assured everyone that she'd get Mark fixed up in no time. As they waited on the food to be made, Kenny spent a little time pushing Duck on a swing that Lee had fixed up, before going to the barn where Katjaa was helping to check the dairy cow that the St. John's owned. As he walked in, he noticed one of the brothers locking up a door in the back of the barn. The guy was acting kind of suspicious, and it was clear something that they weren't supposed to see was behind that door. He tried to share his suspicions with Lily, assuming she'd want to know if there was something unsafe on the farm, but she blew him off and told him to forget about it. But he couldn't just set it aside. His family was on the farm, and if there was something that could hurt them, he needed to know. As soon as Lee returned from hunting for bandits in the woods, Kenny clued him in on the situation and asked him to help get through the door. They were almost busted, and Lee made the mistake of asking Andy directly about it, but thankfully, Andy was an idiot and didn't do much beyond telling them to stay out of the room. As the dinner bell rang, Kenny saw the perfect chance to solve the mystery as Lee managed to secure a tool to help them open the door. Telling Lee he'd cover for him, Kenny went to the house and settled down at the table to eat. He was hoping Lee would discover something, but nothing could have prepared him for what would happen when Lee finally made it inside. Everyone was eating, most choosing not to wait for Lee as he went to wash up, but within minutes, dinner was brought to a screeching halt as Lee rushed into the room and told them all that the food on their plates was Mark. Try as he might, there was nothing Kenny could do over the next few minutes, as Lee was knocked unconscious and the St. John brothers marched everyone out to the barn at gunpoint. Everyone, that is, except for Katjaa and Duck. They were locked inside a storage locker in the back of the building for several minutes before Lee finally came to. But to Kenny, it felt like an eternity, as he imagined the horrible things the St. Johns might be doing to his wife and son. He knew deep down that they had to still be alive, as the family needed Katjaa to help with the cow, but he also knew he needed to get to them before anything bad happened. As if the situation wasn't bad enough, Larry had another heart problem, but this time he went down and didn't get back up. All Kenny could imagine was Larry coming back as a zombie and killing them all, leaving Katjaa and Duck all alone at the mercy of the sick, twisted St. Johns. He pleaded for Lee to help him, but his friend couldn't see reason. Larry was dead. It was the most obvious thing in the world, but Lee was siding with Lily and putting any chance Kenny might have of saving his wife and son in jeopardy. Throwing caution to the wind, Kenny picked up one of the salt cubes sitting in the corner of the locker and slammed it on Larry's head. All the air left the room for what seemed like hours as the weight of his actions landed on his chest. Lily would never forgive him, and even Lee seemed angrier than he needed to be. But Kenny had done what needed to be done for the good of the group. Lee would understand eventually, probably even thanking him when he realized that Clem had been in danger as well. After that, things seemed to turn a corner as Lee managed to get the air conditioning unit off the wall, and Clementine was able to escape into the adjacent room and open the door of the locker, freeing them all. Making his way out of the room, Kenny found himself standing in what was obviously a human slaughterhouse. Blood was everywhere, and all he could think about was saving his family. Lee tried to stop him, but ultimately they teamed up to get past Danny St. John, and Kenny made his way to the house in search of Katjaa and Duck. He would find his son being held hostage by Andy, but before he could do anything, Andy shot him. It wasn't a fatal shot, but it was enough to sideline him as Lee took charge and rushed Andy. The fight didn't last long though, and they would wind up leaving the final St. John to die at the hands of an incoming horde. Kenny tried to talk to Lee as they made their way back to the motor inn, but Lee didn't want to hear what he had to say. He still blamed himself for Herschel's son dying, even months later, and now he'd killed Lily's dad. He wasn't proud of his actions, but he was willing to do what needed to be done. Lee was just too blind and full of himself to understand. But even in the darkness, a light appeared in the form of an abandoned car full of supplies. Even with everything that had gone wrong, they would be able to manage just a little longer thanks to some stranger that they'd never meet. But Lee even turned that down, and Kenny was starting to really not like him. A full stomach helped him feel a little better though, and he was able to go over things a little more easily in his mind in the coming days. Lee had only been doing what he thought was right, and what if Larry hadn't really been dead? It all seemed a lot clearer in hindsight, and now he had the blood of both a son and a father on his hands. But he still had his family, and that made all of his actions worth it. About a week later, Kenny finds himself going into Macon to scavenge for anything that's left in the drugstore with Lee at his side. He hasn't forgiven Lee entirely for not helping him with Larry, but he's also not as mad as he was. Lee had his reasons, even if Kenny doesn't agree with them. As they're working their way over the semi-trailer that's lodged against the building, the ladder they've been using for trips snaps loose, and Kenny is the only one able to make it up. Lee manages to get an old army jeep moved, climbing on the hood so that Kenny can reach him, but the bullet wound in Kenny's side causes him to drop Lee on the first attempt. Before they can try again, the sound of someone screaming echoes through the street, and both men look up to see a young woman come barreling out of a building down the road, drawing zombies out of hiding places all around her. As bad as it is, her misfortune is an opportunity in Kenny's eyes. Her screams are drawing the dead to her, making their locations obvious and keeping them distracted. As Lee is about to shoot her, seeing it as a mercy, Kenny insists on letting her live. He isn't sure that he can get through to Lee, but his argument works, and the two manage to make their way into the pharmacy as the girl's screams persist for a few moments more. By the time she goes quiet, they've just about completely cleared out the pharmacy, and they're making their way back as the horde finally comes their way. Kenny clears the counter, heading for the exit as Lee starts to follow him. But as Lee comes out of the back, zombies burst through the door. Time freezes, and Kenny stands there in shock as Lee struggles to free himself from under the pile. The two men have been friends for months, but the way Lee acted in the storage locker still bugs him. It's enough to make him consider leaving Lee there, to go back and tell the others that Lee didn't make it and move on. But just as he's wiping that thought from his mind, Lee manages to free himself, and the pair make it out and head back to the motor inn together. Kenny can't believe his own actions. How could he even entertain the thought of leaving Lee behind like that? It's something he knows was wrong, and he decides he's got to put what happened behind him and not forsake his friend again. Lily is thrilled at the haul, and doesn't seem too bothered with the fact that Macon is almost completely drained of supplies. She insists they need to spend the winter at the motor inn, but Kenny isn't having it. Thankfully, Lee backs him up on the idea of leaving, but the conversation is derailed when she starts throwing around accusations that someone is stealing supplies. After the fight with Lily, Kenny sits down with Katjaa to talk about what he thinks needs to be done around the camp. She isn't thrilled about everyone carrying guns, but he insists it's for the best. Lee comes over after a few minutes, finding the middle ground between them like he's so good at doing, before asking them about a broken flashlight. He also pulls Kenny aside and tells him that he was a killer before the outbreak started. He doesn't get into details, but he makes it clear that Duck is safe around him, and in the end, Kenny appreciates the honesty, even if he doesn't like the situation. But that winds up becoming even less of an issue a few minutes later, as the thing Kenny had feared would happen, happens. Bandits come over the wall, holding the group at gunpoint as they demand supplies. It all happened too fast to stop, but Lee, who had been in one of the rooms with Lily, comes out and manages to keep the leader busy long enough for Lily to shoot him, and they all manage to get to cover. Kenny runs to the RV, working to get it started as Lee covers the group so they can all make it to the vehicle as well. As he's desperately turning the key over and over, he looks up to see Katjaa and Duck fall down under a zombie. Lee manages to take the thing out, and Kenny runs over, picking them up and ushering them into the motorhome. He's finally able to get the vehicle started, and in the blink of an eye they're busting out onto the street and making their way into the night. As far as Kenny can tell, no one's hurt, but it isn't long before they're stopping as a zombie fails to get out of the way of the speeding RV and winds up jammed underneath. Lily had been arguing with someone as Kenny was driving, and she continues whatever tirade she was on as Kenny climbs under the vehicle to clear the axle. He overhears something about someone stealing supplies, but he's too busy to get too involved until the zombie is finally out. As he walks back to see what all the fuss is about, a gunshot rings out and Carly falls to the ground. Whatever was being said was enough to cause Lily to pull out her gun and shoot Carly. As Lee grabs Lily, taking her gun and pinning her against the RV, Kenny decides he's done with her and tells everyone except Lily to get back in the motorhome. He's a bit surprised to see Lee agree with him, and within minutes they're pulling away as she fades into the rearview mirror. But as he's getting the RV moving again, Katjaa reveals that Duck was bitten by the zombie that attacked them as they fled the motor inn. She doesn't know what's going to happen, but if she's not worried, he doesn't see a reason to worry. Even so, Duck and Clementine were close, so Kenny and Katjaa decide to tell Lee and ask him to break the news to Clementine. He seems a little more panicked than Kenny expected, but he doesn't push the issue. By morning, they find themselves hitting a roadblock in the form of a train. But that turns into a blessing as Lee finds a way to start it up, and they're able to get it moving with relative ease. Going from an RV to a 200-ton iron box on wheels should have been the start of their luck changing, but it was actually the beginning of the end. As they're rolling along, Lee comes into the cab to tell him that Katjaa wants the train stopped. Duck is fading, but Kenny doesn't want to accept it. Reluctantly, he brings the train to a halt and goes back to see his wife and son. The boy looks awful, and Kenny's heart breaks as he tries to come to terms with what has to be done. He can't imagine how it would even be possible for him to end his baby boy's life, but he also doesn't see another way. Then Lee speaks up, offering to do it for him. He feels like some kind of failure for not being strong enough to handle the pain, but Lee reassures him by pointing out that no parent should ever have to do something like that. Kenny and Katjaa set off into the nearby woods, planning to say their goodbyes before Lee joins them. As they reach a peaceful clearing, Katjaa sets Duck down, looking at him with tears running down her face. It's at that moment that Kenny sees the gun in her hands. Before he can react, she raises the barrel to her head and pulls the trigger. Minutes, or maybe hours or weeks, pass before Kenny realizes Lee is standing next to him in shock. The day started with so much promise. It had only been a few hours prior that they'd returned from Macon with a big load of supplies, and now the world seems to have ended for a second time. Kenny barely remembers getting back onto the train. There's a moment where he shares a drink with Chuck, the homeless guy that had joined them as they endeavored to take his shelter, but even that doesn't seem real. They have to stop the train one more time when a tanker truck hanging from a bridge blocks their way. But even meeting Krista and Omid at that juncture is nothing more than a flash in his mind. If it weren't for the surprise message from a strange voice on Clementine's walkie-talkie as they approached Savannah, the rest of the ride probably wouldn't have even been worth remembering. But reaching the coastal city with the promise of a boat and the smell of salt water in the air breathes new life into Kenny. He can't let what happened bring him down too. He had it coming. He knew that saving his boy over Herschel's kid would come back to get him, but there's still a group of people depending on him, and he's going to make up for his mistakes. They're only a couple of blocks away from the docks when a church bell above them starts to ring, bringing a horde of zombies down on them within seconds. Kenny is nearly taken out by a zombie, but Lee saves him at the last second and the group manages to escape into the backyard of a nearby house. They break into the building and work on securing it, with Lee covering the main level as Kenny and Ben head upstairs. There aren't a lot of rooms to check, but Kenny finds a pull-down that leads to an attic and makes his way up as they're finishing their inspection. But unlike the rest of the house, this space isn't clear. A zombie child, not much older or bigger than Duck, is lying on the floor, barely moving as it has hardly any muscle left. It's not hard to imagine what happened, but when Kenny looks, all he can see is his son. Lee joins him at some point and insists that Kenny be the one to end the boy's suffering. He doesn't think he can do it, but Lee's words give him the strength to pull the trigger, and a weight seems to fall off his chest. He's still hurting, but knowing that he was able to end someone else's suffering gives him something to build on. Lee buries the boy and they set off for the docks, planning to find a boat before bringing the rest of the group along. But there are no workable boats left. Kenny tries desperately to find a solution, but the few husks of boats scattered around are beyond repair. And that defeat was just one too many for Kenny. Back at the house, he's all but given up on any kind of escape from the horrors of the new world, drowning himself in a bottle of whiskey while he waits on whatever might be coming next. But what comes next is a bright light in the form of a boat that was hiding right under their noses. Clementine found it while playing in the shed behind the house, and after a cursory inspection, Kenny finds that the only thing it needs is a battery and some gas. The city itself won't be much help, as they find out from a few other survivors that they've met that someplace called Crawford looted everything worth taking. The only way they're going to be able to make the boat plan work is to sneak into the secretive community and steal what they need. That turns out to be a little easier than they planned, however, as the dead have already turned the place into a graveyard. There's no one there to stop them as they scavenge, and Kenny works with Bree, a cancer survivor that used to call Crawford home, to get the gas, while everyone else fans out to get the medicine and a battery. Everything was going well until it wasn't. After getting the gas, Kenny started working with Ben, who'd been trying to break into the armory. They needed something better than the tools that they'd brought with them to get beyond the door, and Kenny asked Ben to see if he could find an axe or some kind of mallet. A few minutes later, Ben came running back into the room, followed closely by Lee, Molly, Clementine, and a horde of zombies. Doubling his effort, Kenny started kicking the armory door with everything he had in him as the rest of the group panicked behind him. Ben, in particular, was mouthing off about something, and just as Kenny finally forced the door open, he realized what the young man was saying. Ben was admitting to being the cause of the bandits attacking the motor inn. The reason Katjaa and Duck were dead. A blind rage filled him as he ran toward Ben. He didn't know what he was going to do, but he knew that Ben had to pay. Lee and Vernon held him back, and when he finally calmed down enough, he let everyone know that the boat they were getting supplies for wasn't big enough for everyone, and that Ben wasn't welcome to join them. Lee suggested a vote on the matter, but Kenny's mind was made up. Before they could really get into things, though, the dead finally breached the room, and they all made their way into the armory, filing up the stairs inside before reaching the top of what turned out to be a bell tower. A ladder on the outside of the tower allowed them to climb down, but as Kenny was climbing out, he looked back to see Ben being grabbed by a zombie that had been hanging from the bell. Lee shot the thing, causing Ben to fall, and then he jumped down to try and save the young man. With a glance, Kenny told Lee what he thought and climbed down to wait on his friend. When Lee finally joined them, he was alone, and Kenny was glad to see that Lee had done the right thing. Ben was the cause of all of their problems, the reason Kenny's family was gone, and now he had paid for those crimes. Getting back to the house, Kenny got to work on the boat, making it seaworthy in only a matter of hours. Going back inside, he ran into Krista and Omid, and finally went looking for Lee, who seemed to have disappeared. They would find Lee in the alleyway behind the house. He'd been looking for Clementine, who appeared to have been taken, and in his haste, he'd been bitten by a zombie. It seemed impossible, but they couldn't dwell on the reality because Clem had been kidnapped by Vernon, or so they thought. The bunker where the cancer survivors had been was deserted, and a voice claiming to be the kidnapper rang through the walkie-talkie the girl had dropped when she was taken to tell them that she wasn't going to be given back. Lee was getting sicker as they tried to figure out a way to get back to the house, and he nearly died more than once as they climbed a ladder up an elevator shaft and worked to ring a bell to draw the dead away from the fire escape they needed to use. Finally getting back to the house, they discovered the boat had been stolen, with a note from Vernon telling them he took it and confirming that Clementine wasn't with them. That wasn't even the worst of it, as the number of zombies in the streets seemed to have tripled over the hours since they'd returned from Crawford, and they soon found themselves being forced into the attic of the house to escape death. But as Kenny realized they just locked themselves in a restricted space with the man who was likely to turn into a zombie, he flashed back to the meat locker and imagined himself having to smash Lee's head instead of Larry's. That wouldn't be necessary though, as Lee exposed a weakness in one of the walls by throwing a bust at it, and they were soon breaking through into the next building. Climbing out a window onto the roof of yet another building, they started making their way to the Marsh house, having heard Clementine's voice briefly pop up on the radio to tell them where she was being held. The overall mood was positive, as everyone was focused on saving Clementine, but that quickly turned as Kenny gave Lee a pat on the shoulder, accidentally knocking the walkie-talkie, their one connection to Clementine and whoever had taken her, out of Lee's hand. That probably wouldn't have been the end of the world, except that it fell through a hole in the roof that they were walking on and landed in a room below. They were debating whether it was even worth going down for when Krista took it upon herself to hop down and grab it. But she wasn't able to get back up, despite the best efforts of Lee and Omid, and as zombies were starting to wake up in the room around her, Kenny knew what he had to do. He'd lost so much because he failed to save Herschel's son, but he could pay for that by saving Krista. Hopping down, he gave the woman a boost up and told the group above to focus on saving Clem. The zombies were closing in around him, and he did his best to fight them off, eventually escaping through a door and working his way to safety. But he had no way of making it back to Lee and the others, and he wasn't even sure he wanted to. For the next few months, he drifted around, barely surviving and keeping mostly to himself. He was in a dark place mentally, but he couldn't bring himself to do what Katjaa had done. He couldn't give up completely like that. Occasionally, he'd come in contact with other survivors, but he never stuck around with any of them for very long. Through these contacts, though, he heard about a possible settlement to the north, a place called Wellington. It wasn't really a place he was too interested in getting to, at least until he met Sarita. She found him as he was hiding from the world in a small restaurant, and while he was reluctant at first to travel with her, they eventually grew very close. She helped him forget about everything that had happened, and he tried to avoid talking about Katjaa and Duck with her for fear of what she might think. It was a new chance for him to start over, maybe to build something with someone new. But he knew that they needed someplace safe if they were going to make a life together, and the only place that he could think of that might work was Wellington. The only problem was, he didn't exactly know where it was. Rumors said it was somewhere in Michigan, but even those who seemed the most certain of its existence seemed clueless to its location. Either way, he knew they needed to head north to look for it. Even for all his travels, he'd still wound up back in Georgia by the time he met Sarita, meaning they'd need to trek through several states before reaching their destination. They came across the occasional survivors as they went, but none were quite as friendly and welcoming as Walt and Matthew. The pair had managed to secure a ski lodge, scavenging a decent amount of food and supplies, which they freely gave out to travelers who were passing through. Matthew would often spend time wandering the mountain, and Walt seemed to love him all the more for his adventurous spirit. The lodge almost felt like a cozy home, and Kenny and Sarita decided it would be a great spot to spend a couple of months before heading further north. They saw plenty of others come and go, but one evening they found a rather large and somewhat hostile group snooping around the lodge. Walt was doing his best to calm everyone down, but Kenny didn't like how this group in particular seemed to be acting, and he wanted them gone. But the argument and anger died in an instant when Kenny saw a ghost from his past emerge from the middle of the group. Clementine. He couldn't believe she was alive, let alone standing in front of him. There were no words to describe the moment, but she said all that needed to be said with a massive hug. He'd spent many nights imagining what might have happened to her, wondering if Lee had managed to save her, if he'd found some way to overcome the odds. Learning of his friend's heroic actions and passing brought peace of mind that he didn't even know he needed. But the reappearance of Clementine seemed to be more of a harbinger than anything else. A few hours after she arrived, Kenny and Walt discovered another stranger sneaking around outside the ski lodge. It was a woman named Bonnie that said she was just looking for supplies, and Walt, being the kind person he was, offered her a whole box of food with no questions asked. Kenny saw the move as incredibly stupid, and that opinion was only reinforced not long after as the group that included Bonnie showed up and took everyone hostage. Kenny was able to hide and even took out one of the members of the group as they stood in the window of the lodge. But when the leader shot Walt and threatened to shoot Clementine, he knew that surrendering was the only option. The man in charge was some guy named Carver, and while the majority of Clementine's friends seemed to be afraid of him, Kenny wasn't falling for the tough guy act. He'd seen it before, and he knew that the only way to deal with people like Carver was to confront them head on. Even as they were tied up in the back of the box truck, being transported to wherever the group called home, Kenny was trying to convince everyone to stand up and fight. They needed to break free and take out Carver before he killed them all. But no one was having any of it. Even Clementine seemed resolved to falling in line. And he probably would have been better off just listening to her. He managed to free himself from the ropes binding his hands, but as he was preparing to fight whoever might open the door of the truck, he found himself slamming into it face first. He was seeing stars as Sarita leaned over him to make sure he was okay, and the next thing he knew, he was being escorted with everyone else through what appeared to be a house hardware store. There was a ton of food and other supplies on the shelves, but he knew those things were only window dressing. They were thrown into what amounted to an outdoor prison cell with a few others, and would spend the first night contemplating the possibility of never being free again. The next morning, Carver tried to sound like something other than a prison warden as he explained what would be happening that day. Kenny and Mike wound up working together on an expansion to the complex, but Kenny wasn't happy with being bossed around. Mike kept telling him what he needed to do, which eventually got Kenny so riled up that he shoved the man against one of the exterior walls. He knew that wasn't the best move, but he could only take so much and he was at his limit. Clementine appeared in the doorway as they were fighting, causing Kenny to back off. But as he let Mike go, the board he had pinned him against came free and a group of zombies came bursting through the glass. It was all they could do to fight the group off, and one of Carver's men had to come down to help, making the situation much worse. Only a couple hours after that, Kenny and Mike were surprised to see Luke hiding in the shadows. Kenny thought that he had probably cut and run as the rest of them had been dragged out of the ski lodge, but it turned out he'd followed them the whole way to the house hardware and wanted to help them escape. Luke's plan involved getting him one of Carver's radios so he could monitor what was going on inside the compound, but Kenny wasn't thrilled with that idea. He wanted to use the incoming herd of zombies to escape. He was arguing for this idea that evening, facing a lot of resistance from the rest of the group, when Jane, a girl that had been mostly keeping to herself, spoke up in support of his idea. Well, mostly in support of it. She said that they could cover themselves in zombie guts and march through the herd with no issues. Kenny thought the idea was insane until Clementine spoke up and said that her and Lee had used the same method to escape back at the Marsh house. Deciding to use a combination of plans, the group secured a pair of walkie-talkies, thanks to Clementine, and set in motion a chain of events that would lead to them getting their freedom. It wasn't quite as simple as they'd hoped, though. Luke was caught trying to steal food the next day, and Carver found one of the radios. He was trying to seem forgiving, telling the group that he would let it go if they returned the other radio, but Kenny suspected there was more to the ruse. Clementine had the second radio, and she was supposed to have given it to Luke, but Kenny managed to grab it from her as she was about to show Carver, and he wound up taking the blame in the form of a brutal beating. He was in and out of consciousness for the rest of the day, but he finally started to come to later in the evening. The first thing he was aware of was the group arguing about whether to leave or not. Forcing himself out of bed, he made it clear that he wasn't staying there another night. He still felt weak, but his strength had returned enough to push for leaving as planned. Clementine snuck out of the enclosure and turned on the PA system to lure the herd of zombies closer to the building. As soon as the system came on, Bonnie let them all out and they made their way to the loading dock. They were working on getting one of the bay doors open when Carver showed up and began threatening them at gunpoint. Thankfully, Clementine wound up getting the drop on Carver just in time to save everyone. With the tables turned, the rest of the group made their way outside as Kenny and Rebecca, who had as much reason to hate Carver as Kenny did, hung back to take their retribution on the man who'd hurt so many. It wasn't a pretty sight, but Kenny didn't really care as he could only partly see it anyways thanks to what Carver had done to him. The only thing he really cared about was making sure that Carver could never hurt anyone again. After finishing up there, he joined the others as they covered themselves in zombie guts and started moving through the herd as gunshots from Carver's group rang out into the night. At some point, Kenny and Sarita became separated, and he would wind up looking all around for her before finally spotting her standing next to Clementine. As he ran over, he realized that Sarita had been bitten, but he knew that she would be okay if they acted fast enough. Making their way through the herd, he managed to get her safely to the Civil War memorial that they'd all planned to meet at, but she wasn't doing well at all. When he realized it was too late to cut off her arm and save her, he fell back into the dark place he'd been prior to meeting her. He'd known all along that he didn't deserve to be happy, and he couldn't protect the people that he cared about, and now Sarita was just another example of that. It could have been hours, or maybe weeks for all he knew, as she slowly deteriorated. He vaguely remembered yelling at Clementine, saying some things that he knew weren't true, but none of that felt important. Wanting to be alone and hoping that Sarita wouldn't turn, he took his love into a nearby tent and waited for her to take her last breath. But his hope was dashed as she began to reanimate, and tears clouded the one eye that he had left as he put a knife into her and said a final goodbye. It felt like his world had ended again. He didn't know if he could go on. But Clementine reminded him that there were still people that needed him in the world, especially Rebecca, who was about to give birth, and he turned his attention to doing what he could to pull the group together. It wasn't easy over the next couple of hours, as they had to fight off a horde of zombies just to get Rebecca to a place where she could have the baby. Her water had broken while Kenny was dealing with Sarita, and the need for safety and shelter was higher than it had ever been. As the evening light arrived, a new life came into the world, with Kenny helping to make it possible. Through everything that happened, there was still something worth fighting for, and Kenny resolved to give his last breath defending the baby boy and Clementine. And there was one place he knew that would be possible: Wellington. Rebecca wouldn't make it to see her baby grow up though, as she died the next day en route to finding a warm place with supplies. They lost Luke and Bonnie as well while crossing a frozen lake, trying to get to a construction site that a man named Arvo had told them would have supplies. He and his friends had tried to rob them before finding out how much of a mistake that was, and Kenny would have killed Arvo as well if not for the rest of the group lobbying to follow the man to possible supplies. But that lead didn't pan out better than any others, and Kenny found himself more focused than ever on finding Wellington. It was somewhere in the north, and he planned to make it there, come hell or high water. They only stayed in the building Arvo led them to for part of the night, as Mike and Arvo tried to steal the vehicle that Kenny had gotten running. The pair of cowards fled into the woods after shooting Clem, and Kenny made sure no one else could try to steal the vehicle by piling her, AJ, and Jane into the truck and hitting the road. But Jane wasn't really helping matters, as she kept hounding him as he drove. As Clementine finally woke up, having passed out from being shot, things got even more tense as Jane started making more personal attacks. She was going for the things that Kenny was already questioning in his own mind, saying that Sarita knew that Kenny couldn't protect her and how everyone around him knew they were going to die. He was starting to feel the anger building in him when a pileup of cars appeared through the snowstorm in front of them, and he had to slam on the brakes. After making sure everyone was okay, he got out of the truck and went to look for some fuel as they were running low. But a group of zombies forced him to retreat, and the storm made it impossible to get back to the truck. He eventually made his way to the rest stop he'd told Clem and Jane to meet him at if things got bad, and he resolved to warm up and wait a few minutes before going to look for them. But he wouldn't have to wait too long, as Clementine came through the door not long after, telling him Jane had AJ with her. A couple minutes later, Jane came in herself, but she wasn't carrying a child. She didn't explain herself, but Kenny could see from the look in her eyes that something wasn't right. He rushed off into the storm, hoping that his worst fears hadn't come to pass. But he had to return to the building empty-handed. If Jane had returned without the baby, that could only mean one thing. She'd left it to die, or maybe even caused its death. In a fit of rage, he attacked Jane, putting every ounce of strength he had into making her pay for whatever she might have done. She got a couple of good blows in, but in the end, he drove a knife into her before collapsing in the snow. As it turned out, though, the whole thing was for nothing, as the cry of an infant somewhere nearby caught his and Clementine's attention. Jane had stuck the baby in an abandoned car, wanting to provoke him and force his hand. He couldn't believe that she would stoop that low, but thankfully Clementine understood the situation, and they decided together to keep heading to Wellington. It took a little over a week, but they finally reached the walls of the mythical settlement. It seemed like a dream come true, but it wasn't as perfect as they'd hoped. A woman standing guard at the gate informed them that there was no space left inside. But Kenny wouldn't accept that. He begged them to at least take Clementine and AJ, saying he would even give up the supplies they were offering if that would make it possible. More than anything else, he needed them to be safe, needed to know that everything they'd lost hadn't been in vain. Clementine didn't like the idea of staying while Kenny left, but she seemed to understand. He fought the urge to turn around as he heard the doors of the settlement closing behind him. This was for the best. He'd finally managed to save someone, to make up at least a little for all the bad that he'd done and all the people he'd been unable to protect. He'd never forget Katjaa, Duck, Lee, Sarita, or any of the others that he loved, but he would at least know he'd been able to make things right for Clementine and AJ. So that's Kenny's story, but should we call him a friend or a foe? Kenny is one of the deepest, most well-developed characters I've ever encountered in any form of media. He doesn't always make the best decisions, but he is fiercely loyal to those he cares about. That being said, there are a couple of things I want to point out about Kenny that bugged me. For one, he's very quick to act, often without giving any thought to how his actions might affect others or how they might impact the group as a whole. Going all the way back to the storage locker on the St. John's farm, Kenny was worried about his family, but he was way too quick to act on what he assumed was the death of Larry. If it had been Katjaa instead of Larry, he would have been right there trying to resuscitate her rather than rushing to finish her off. That becomes clear later on when Duck is bitten and he goes into denial. Another thing that bothers me is how quick he is to anger and how irrational he acts. He constantly picks fights with Lily, almost seeming to want arguments over little things at every turn and looking for constant support from those he considers friends. And if you don't support him at every turn, he acts like you never support him. One of those big moments that made me wonder about who Kenny truly is was the moment where he seems to be willing to leave Lee to die under the door in the pharmacy. In a way, it's kind of parody with the earlier interaction where he comes back for you, but it's also not something I could see Kenny doing in reality. And the reaction is based solely on what happens in the meat locker. If you help Kenny, he'll come to save you. If you helped Lily, though, he'll stand by and let you save yourself. Even if you sided with him in every single situation before the locker, he'll still use that one interaction to determine whether to help you or not. I also want to point out that the ideal ending for Kenny is leaving Clementine and AJ behind at Wellington. That ending allows him to have some closure and wraps up his story nicely. He spent so much time trying to protect others and feeling like he's failed in that task, that knowing that he was able to provide some form of safety for the kids in the end will be good for him. Imagine that he chose to have Clem and AJ leave with him, and one or both of them were killed later under his watch. It would be just one more thing that he would see as a failure, and it could be the final straw for him. With all of that, though, I would say that Kenny is a friend. He's not perfect, but he does try. And ultimately, that is what this series is looking for. Intention is important, and Kenny's intention is to look out for those he cares about. Even those he doesn't like fall under his protective umbrella. Taking a moment to look at the situation with Ben, you might notice that he didn't make it past Crawford in this retelling of Kenny's tale. That's because I think the better ending for Kenny in Season 1 is saving Krista. The ending where he locks Lee out of the alleyway to shoot Ben is rather poor in my opinion. For one thing, Ben is dying either way. The best thing to do would be to shoot him, ending his suffering, and then climb back up on the roof with Lee. There is zero reason that Kenny needs to lock himself in with the dead, and there is no chance he actually escapes the situation. But having been alive does give Kenny a moment of humility in the backyard of the house when he rips into Kenny about how he's been treating him. It's a moment that I wish we could have gotten without having Kenny go into the alleyway, because I think it plays well into Kenny's development. The better scenario would have been having Ben around when Kenny accidentally knocks the radio into the room below later on. And then Ben goes down to retrieve it and needs to be rescued by Kenny. That would have not only shown growth on Ben's character, who could have been kept around a bit longer, but it also shows growth in Kenny, who would be willing to sacrifice himself to save the person responsible for his wife and son's death. But rewrites will have to wait for another series later on down the road. I'm curious about your opinions on Kenny though. Do you think he's truly a friend, or is he actually a foe? It's tempting to say that he might be a foe if you antagonize him throughout the game, going for the worst possible outcome, but to be fair, who wouldn't be a little angry at someone who is constantly getting under their skin? This video took a lot of work. Kenny is a complex character who plays a huge role in 9 out of the first 10 episodes of the game. So if you liked it, please hit the thumbs up button and subscribe if you haven't already. I'm also open to suggestions for characters you'd like to see in the future on here, from The Walking Dead or any other game that I might cover at some point, so leave those down in the comments below. For those who like to see the videos before everyone else, I've got channel memberships and a Patreon where you can get some cool perks like early access, your name in the videos, and behind the scenes stuff. Memberships are available here on YouTube, and the Patreon is linked in the description down below. I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
I thought about Duck today, about his dumb little face. First things that come to mind are always the dumb things he was doing. Kid was always running in circles. Every damn place he went, he'd just run. You couldn't stop him. Makes it harder to remember he was a good boy. Well, long day tomorrow. One long day. I know I can be a real shit sometimes.
Stop.
No, it's true. But I miss my boy. I miss him so much. I didn't raise him like I should have. Made mistakes. Wasn't there a whole lot for a couple years. Off on a boat somewhere or other. I thought I enjoyed that time away from him. From my family. But I'd give anything for one more second with them. To play catch with Duck. To touch Katjaa's face. Anything in the world. You know what it feels like to get beaten almost to death. Peaceful. It feels peaceful. It was like I was floating away, watching the whole thing happen to me. And then I woke up again, and nothing's changed. I'm still taking a beating. Every day. Duck, Katjaa, Sarita. No peace. No rest. The punches just keep coming. Why the hell couldn't Carver have just finished me off? Obviously, I ain't helping anyone by being here.
That baby's almost here, and Rebecca needs your help.
Yeah, I guess she does.